I don't think it's any surprise that media is basically integrated into our everyday lives, whether it be video games, TV shows, or even movies. We often find ourselves liking certain characters in these forms of media, and then sometimes right after think, I wonder what other stuff they've been a part of. I happen to be a huge fan of the Amazon Prime original series The Boys, and cannot wait for what Season 3 has to offer later in the future. In the later episodes of Season 2, the show introduces a former member of the Seven, Lamplighter. Despite the main focus of the show being about corrupted superheroes, I ended up liking his character a lot and wanted to know more about the guy who plays him. And from there, I would get introduced to a video game that I never thought I would end up loving so much.
Come as you are, as a friend, as an old enemy. Take your time, hurry up. Choice is yours, don't delay.
This is Quantum Break, and we're going to talk about it, because I genuinely think this game is severely underrated. I can't believe it's almost been 5 years since this game came out, so you're probably wondering why I'm reviewing this game again. I don't hate the initial review I made, but it made me wish I talked about the game more and that the video itself was a bit longer. I also didn't do very much additional research before making it, but now I have, and we have a lot to talk about, so let's not waste any more time. During E3 2013, a certain video game company showed off an announcement trailer for their brand new game, and that game was Quantum Break. Quantum Break is a third-person science fiction action shooter developed by Remedy Entertainment. The game would then receive major changes since its initial trailer, and then be released in April of 2016, exclusively on Xbox One and PC, due to Microsoft having interest in the IP wanting to publish the game. The two ports have minor differences, along with one that I actually need to talk about, which is something I'll get into in a bit. In Quantum Break, you play as Jack Joyce, who was voiced, mocapped, and modeled after actor Shawn Ashmore. Shawn is mainly recognized from his role as Iceman, aka Bobby Drake in X-Men, and more recently Lamplighter in The Boys Season 2, as already mentioned prior. If Shawn happens to look familiar, then it's possible you might have seen his identical twin brother, Aaron. Upon looking at the announcement trailer again, we can clearly see that Jack looks a lot different than how he looks in the final game. Prior to Shawn being the final lead role as Jack Joyce, we'd see two actors act as a placeholder role for him as well. Gethin Anthony, who was the early mocap actor, and Sean Dury, who was also the early voice, mocap, and face model, and someone who we see in the E3 trailer and in the final game. Before we get into the game, there's something I want you to listen to. This is Quantum Break's main menu theme, and it is superb. Every time I open this game and want to play it, I sometimes sit on the menu just to listen to this for a bit. It's incredibly soothing and I enjoy humming to it a lot. This main menu is also incredibly unique in terms of its theme, but that's something I'll get into later. But since we're here and happen to be talking about the music, upon going into the audio options, the game by default has something called Low Dynamic Range Mode turned off. If you want to get most out of your first time playing this game, then I heavily recommend turning it on, so that everything you hear doesn't seem too quiet. If you're a headset wearer, then this option definitely needs to be turned on. If you've played any recent Capcom games utilizing the RE engine, then you're probably already familiar of what this option is and what it does. One more thing to note is that this game allows you to disable copyrighted music in case you plan on streaming it, so if you do, definitely enable that. But now that that's out of the way, let's discover the story of Jack Joyce and what Quantum Break is all about. Quantum Break puts you in the role of Jack Joyce. After 6 years of being away from his hometown of Riverport, Massachusetts, he returns at the request of a childhood friend, Paul Serene. He tells Jack to meet him at the Riverport University's Meyer Physics Research Center, where they both reunite with each other. After guiding Jack through the building, they make their way into what Paul calls the Project Promenade Lab. Paul then starts to reveal little by little of what this project is until Jack is eventually like,
"This is a corridor for... You're actually going inside that thing? In the machine, through time. It's a fucking time machine."
Paul tells Jack that he needed his help in specific because this project wasn't strictly speaking legal, which doesn't seem to faze Jack at all. And if that they didn't prove its functionality, the financial backers would cut the funding, along to prove its functionality to prove Jack's older brother, William, wrong. After successfully setting the time machine for 2 minutes into the future, Jack activates the machine and a future Paul Serene emerges from it. As expected, Jack is astonished as he claims what he's seeing is literally impossible, but Paul rest assures that what he's seeing is real and was successful. Present-day Paul then enters the machine when William appears and isn't too happy to see what they're doing, and demands that the machine gets shut down. Jack refuses, and Will takes it upon himself to distract Jack with a gunshot and attempt to shut it down himself, when the machine's core malfunctions, along with sending out a blast of chronon energy that renders Jack unconscious. Jack awakens almost immediately after, and finds everything around him to be frozen. He finds his brother in the same state and manages to release him from it. The stutter collapses and then the lab is infiltrated by Monarch security. Both are forced to escape and leave Paul behind as he escapes by going through the machine. Going through the maintenance tunnels, both Jack and Will evade security. Will then begins to explain because of what happened in the lab, that time is now broken and is beginning to break down. And if it isn't fixed soon, the end of time will occur and force everything in a permanent zero state. He tells Jack he invented something to stop it, the countermeasure, but stresses that it won't be easy to find it. Making their way towards the university's parking lot, Will tells Jack that he left a specific key that he needs in his briefcase that's in his car, and urges Jack to be careful as he goes outside to retrieve it. Upon opening his car door, Jack is interrupted by gunshots, and out of natural reaction discovers a brand new time ability called Time Stop. Time Stop is the second ability this game introduces and is probably the most useful ability you will use during the entire duration of this game. Using it allows Jack to create a bubble of whatever he's aiming at to temporarily stop it from moving. This ability is also really cool because if you shoot at Time Stop as you activate it, the bullets you fire will stop and won't proceed until the bubble goes away, allowing you to build up bullets and inflict massive damage on most enemies, killing them immediately. Will ends up getting captured by Monarch security and is taken to the library as they're separated. Jack returns to the building and gets introduced to Beth Wilder. He doesn't seem to recognize her, but she recognizes him. She informs Jack of his brother's location and begins heading that way. Before reaching the library, Jack accidentally stumbles upon more of Monarch security and discovers another new time ability, Time Dodge. Time Dodge allows Jack to quickly dash in any direction. This ability is very good if you need to reach a specific area quickly without taking damage, and is pretty useful during later parts of the game. There are more abilities that we get introduced to later on as well. Jack successfully rescues his brother and they both begin to escape the library, until they're halted by a future Paul Serene who attacks them. Paul kills Will, and Jack is knocked unconscious again and is taken in as prisoner by Monarch. And that wraps up the first act of the game. Jack Joyce must be having the worst day of his entire life. So a ton of shit just happened, and I'm sure you're aware of that, but there's a reason behind it. This game is very unique in the way it tells its story, and I'll explain why. Quantum Break is part game and part live action show. Yes, you heard that correctly. You will be playing a video game and watching a TV show in one simultaneous $40 package. So what happens after each act? After an act, you get the chance to play as Paul. Because of future Paul's enhanced time abilities, he is exposed to something called Chronon Syndrome, and this power allows him to see what happens in the future before it actually takes place. Paul's sections are called junctions, and they require you to make a choice that will affect the story in both the game and the TV show. Depending on the choice you make, the game will have minor differences based on what happens. I think this is a neat design decision, because it allows for a second playthrough and also exposes two different perspectives objectives depending on what you decided to choose first. After making your choice, the junction will end and an episode of the live action show will begin to play. These episodes will last about 22 to 26 minutes at most. During these, you can literally just sit back as you would with any other show. Something I need to mention now is that the PC version of Quantum Break requires a decent internet connection to be able to stream the show, and the quality will adjust based on how good it is. If your connection is generally slow, then watching it probably will be very difficult. If this is the case, then I heavily recommend watching the episodes on something like YouTube instead. Those who own the game on Xbox One are able to download all 4 episodes for offline play alongside the base game. I wish this was also the case for PC, but it doesn't seem to be. There are altered releases of the PC version that support offline streaming of the show, but it's up to you if you want to go that route. I don't know the exact quality the show is streamed in, but I would like to assume it's either in 1080p or even 4K if your connection is good enough, essentially Netflix tier quality. Now let's talk about the ports. This game is an Xbox One exclusive, and I'd imagine it's going to make its way being backwards compatible for Xbox Series X, S as well. But overall, it seems to play very well at a consistent 60 FPS at 720p. The loading times aren't too bad, as I personally never had an issue with them, but with the newer console coming out very soon, I'm going to be thrilled to see that the loading screens will be non-existent. Buying the game on Xbox One also grants you a free copy of Alan Wake. How cool is that? The PC version from Steam plays very well, and I had no issues at all completing the game for the very first time. As long as you meet the requirements, your experience should be near flawless. And for a game made in 2016, I'm satisfied to say that it still looks and plays incredibly well. Seriously, this game looks so fucking good for the time it's made. But there's another PC version I haven't mentioned yet. Please avoid the Windows 10 version at all costs and buy it on Steam instead. The Windows 10 port utilizes DirectX 12, while Steam utilizes DirectX 11. And while newer usually means better, the performance with DirectX 12 isn't that great and it stutters a lot, making it almost unplayable. I would have liked to recommend this version, but I can't due to the experience being heavily flawed because of a graphics API not being utilized properly. If you're interested in seeing comparisons, Digital Foundry provides a video in which they showcase just that. Trust me, DirectX 11 is leagues better and is the way you'll want to play this game. It's strange because in the Digital Foundry video, they specify that the engine Quantum Break uses, Remedy's in-house Northlight engine, is DirectX 12 based. So why is the Windows 10 port so bad in terms of performance? I'm not sure, but needless to say, DirectX 11 is overall better. During specific scripted events and cutscenes, the game will lock itself to 30 FPS, and I don't think there's any way around this. After they're over, your FPS will return back to normal. This game is pretty well optimized, and the performance with DirectX 11 is fantastic. A thing to note is that playing this game in either windowed or borderless will for some reason force VSync on, and there's not really a way around it except for playing in full screen. It's kinda odd, but I just switched to full screen after since there isn't much of a difference if you decide to alt-tab at all. Now let's talk about the soundtrack. Quantum Break's soundtrack is really good. I enjoy it a lot. It makes you feel like you're in a proper action game, being an all-around badass utilizing time powers. But unfortunately, the soundtrack composed for this game doesn't seem to appear in the game. I realize how weird that is to say, but it's true. Apparently the soundtrack was composed for a pre-release version of the game, and Microsoft had to do with how most of the actual soundtrack didn't appear in the game, which is honestly sad because it's really good. You can either buy the official soundtrack on Steam, or buy the Timeless Collector's Edition, which includes it as a CD. Alright, now let's talk about the gameplay and the rest of the story. When a game introduces powers, there's bound to be an upgrade system. Jack is able to enhance and make his powers more efficient by collecting chronon sources scattered around various areas during each act. If you're having trouble finding chronon sources, using time vision will be your best bet. For a part of the game I'm gonna mention later, I heavily encourage you to find any and every chronon source that you can. And if you need a collectibles guide, there are plenty available. Time vision is a power I haven't really talked about, but the game lets you know that it wants you to use it a lot, especially if you happen to get stuck somewhere. Another time ability I haven't mentioned yet is Time Shield, which Jack learns before rescuing Will from the library. Time Shield forms a massive bubble around Jack, blocking any bullets that are fired at him as long as he's inside of it. Once he's out of its range or it runs out, the bubble goes away. This ability is incredible, and I'm very glad we get introduced to it so early on in the game. If you find yourself dying a lot during combat, then I recommend putting your chronon sources towards upgrading it, as the first upgrade tier regenerates Jack's health much faster than normal once it's activated. So that's most of his time abilities for now. Let's talk about the weapons. Jack has 3 total inventory slots for weapons. 1 for the handgun, 2 for a rifle, and 3rd for a heavy weapon. The handgun you get at the university is infinite, and it's pretty good against weaker enemies when using time stop. The rifles you get are also very good, and can take out most non-armored enemies in a single headshot. And most of the heavy weapons are good against the bigger enemies you fight later on, as this game does introduce some enemy variety. Weapons do utilize ammo and will run out of ammo, except for the handgun as it remains infinite. When playing and using time vision, you'll come across backpacks that emit a blue highlight whenever you're near one. Pressing its assigned key or button will refill any gun low on ammo. Do you remember how Jack is invulnerable to time stutters due to his powers? You fight enemies just like that, and they also have the equivalent of time dodge, but faster and much longer. These guys make the combat even more great than how it already is. Something one of my friends said while playing this game is that a lot of the effects used in time stutters make it difficult to see where an enemy is and what part of their body you're shooting at. I don't think this is necessarily a big issue, but if the effects were toned down a bit, I do agree that it would be easier and cause less of a headache. Aside from all that, moving Jack around the environment feels pretty natural. There unfortunately isn't a key to sprint, but most of the newer abilities you get later on help with that. And since the beginning of the game, we can clearly see he likes to jog. Control has a key to sprint in that game, and it feels a lot easier to move around because of it. During certain sections of the game, Jack has to climb obstacles, which can seem a bit awkward at times, so I do think this is something that could have been handled better. Overall, the gameplay, combat mechanics, and time powers are good and feel fun to use. It's what really makes this game what it is to me personally. Moving back on track with the story. Jack then regains consciousness when a time stutter hits, taking both Beth Wilder and Liam Burke's weapons with him and using the stutter to his advantage to escape. He then reaches the dry docks to get to Paul, and along the way, depending on the junction choice you make before Act 2 starts, you'll either run into the taxi cab driver, Nick Marsters, who we can clearly recognize was Jack Joyce's placeholder face model in the E3 trailer, or a college student, Amy Ferrero. We see both of these characters before Jack even enters the university at the start of the game, so they probably look familiar if that's the case. After encountering either character, they agree to help Jack get to the dry docks in an attempt to find Paul. As Jack travels deeper into the industrial area, he reaches a place called Ground Zero. Upon exiting, he catches Paul departing in a helicopter with Dr. Sophia Amaral. He attempts to kill Paul by shooting him, but fails. Paul uses his Chronon abilities to create a wreck in an attempt of trapping Jack, but instead Jack ends up escaping the destruction and reunites with Beth at the top of the dry docks. He decides to work with her and takes both him and Nick or Amy to the Bradbury swimming hall, where Will built the first time machine. In an attempt to get it working with what they have, it fails to start. Leaving them with no choice, Beth suggests going to Dr. Amaral and kidnapping her, as she is the most familiar with the machine and can possibly help them get it working. Jack agrees and they head for Gull Island. Once on the island, Jack surrenders himself to both Paul and Hatch, and as Paul suspected that he would. He gets locked up in an interrogation room, but Beth returns to her undercover status and breaks him out. They separate and Jack seeks for Dr. Amaral as they initially planned on. One thing I just need to mention really quick, this man's eyes are so fucking pretty. Okay, they're not actually that blue, but shit, they're still really pretty. Shawn Ashmore really is a fine looking man, holy shit. Actually, nah, that's sugarcoating it. He's fucking hot. Anyway, sorry, we can move on now. As Jack escapes, we learn a new time ability, Time Rush. This is probably my favorite ability in the entire game. Time Rush allows Jack to sprint while slowing down time, allowing him to reach areas and overcome obstacles he normally wouldn't have been able to before. This ability also allows you to instantly one-hit KO certain enemies as you run up to them. Jack makes his way into the Monarch Research Facility and encounters a Juggernaut unit and a Chronon Dampener, and this is where the game becomes a little more challenging. These newly introduced enemies fire constant explosive RPG rounds at Jack, and their weakness is on their back. But thanks to Time Rush, Jack is able to successfully defeat them and retrieve a Chronon harness for Beth to use in Amaral's office and then head for the gala. Going into an area with an active Chronon Dampener completely drains Jack of his time abilities, but luckily it's just a machine and Jack is able to turn it off to renew them. Before Jack reaches the gala, he runs into another machine with an active Chronon Dampener. After turning it off, we get introduced to another Juggernaut unit that utilizes a portable one, but it has very limited range. These enemies are kinda challenging for sure, but aren't that hard to kill. If you happen to be using the shotgun as a heavy weapon, they'll be a breeze to take down. After that, Jack successfully reaches Beth and manages to free her from the active stutter, along with giving her the harness. They reach Amaral Emerald but find an active flying drone heading towards the mansion. Beth urges Jack that they need to free Emerald before the stutter collapses. They manage to free Emerald, but barely, as the drone comes crashing down. Beth separates from Jack as he fends off more of security. Once he finishes them off, he steals one of Paul's sports cars and uses it to escape the island. After their escape, Paul realizes that Emerald has been kidnapped, and that leads him to believe that he was misled by someone within security. His Chronon syndrome acts up and he attacks Hatch, blaming him for what happened. During this, you can either choose to trust Emerald or to trust Hatch, but given the current context, it's no surprise of what you'll probably want to choose here. After escaping, Jack is forced to abandon the sports car due to high security and heads for below Port Donnelly Bridge to meet up with Beth and Emerald. Unfortunately, security is tight, so he chooses to cross it instead. Upon reaching the bridge, several stutters hit, giving Jack the perfect opportunity to cross it. Depending on the first junction choice you made, what's happening on the bridge will differ. Attempting to cross the bridge, he's caught in a shipwreck that destroys it, but ends up surviving because of the stutter. This part of the game is very frustrating, especially if you're playing on hard because the last checkpoint is incredibly far away. Just make sure to be careful and utilize your abilities wisely. Jack ends up traveling down into the shipwreck, but barely makes it out by jumping into the water as the stutter collapses. With Emerald as their hostage, both Jack and Beth demand that they help them fix the machine so that they can go to the past and retrieve the countermeasure. Emerald is hesitant because of what Paul has seen, but is given little choice and cooperates with them. Before leaving the room, Beth tells Jack that they need to talk. She tells Jack that because she met herself as a child in 1999, the past is set and can't be changed, and believes Jack will be convinced of the same when he travels back. All of this manages to convince Jack to go with her plan instead and travel back to July 4th, 2010 to retrieve the countermeasure. Upon restoring power to the time machine, Jack sets the time for July 4th, 2010. Also, I think this is a nice little thing to mention, but Will's time machine actually does work like a proper time machine. Before Beth enters the machine, we can clearly see the machine has two entrances. The path she goes in is clockwise and the other is counterclockwise. It's literally a giant time traveling clock. That's pretty cool. Beth enters the machine, but Emerald resets it for the future at the very last second. Jack isn't pleased with Emerald and decides to go through with the original plan. Once he arrives, he reunites with a traumatized version of Beth. She tells Jack that Emerald sent her to the end of time and that she attempted to kill Paul while she was still there. The two make their way to Will's workshop in the industrial area to find the countermeasure. Upon arriving, Jack yells Will's name, but Beth tells Jack that he isn't there at her own request. Jack unlocks the room where Will has the countermeasure secured, and then Monarch arrives. After Jack fends them off, he discovers that Paul is in the workshop preventing Beth from escaping. Paul attempts to convince Beth to join him and surrender the countermeasure. She refuses and tries to kill him. She fails and Paul shoots her in the shoulder, sending the countermeasure flying out of her hand. It lands on the ground and releases a charge of Chronon energy that creates Ground Zero. The blast sends Jack to the year 2016 as he witnesses Beth's death in a time echo. Jack, now furious, hasn't given up and doesn't plan to. He starts heading for Monarch HQ next. Time begins to collapse at a much faster rate as Jack reaches Monarch HQ. During this part, he'll either be aided by Charlie Wincott or Fiona Miller. Both of them will help Jack and allow him to access secured areas. Going up the elevator, Jack witnesses a shifter attack kill several striker units. This is the first time Jack has ever seen something like this and isn't too thrilled about it. Before reaching Paul's office, he is attacked by the same shifter from before but survives because the stutter collapses and questions if the shifter was Hatch. Inside Paul's office, he heads for the CFR chamber where he either encounters and fights Liam Burke or rescues Charlie from death at the hands of Monarch. Jack successfully retrieves the countermeasure and uses the time machine located inside Monarch Tower to travel back to October 9th, 2016 to save his brother. Arriving moments after the fracture occurs, he makes his way towards the library again and successfully prevents Will's death from happening. After rescuing him, Will convinces Jack to return to the present and use the countermeasure there to fix the fracture. Before escaping, another stutter hits and Jack spots Beth observing his original arrest. He considers pulling her out, but decides against it and instead promises to come back for her. The two brothers return to the swimming hall and set the time machine for Jack's present, October 10th. Upon exiting the machine, Will gets trapped in a stutter and Jack is attacked by security. He fends them off and goes back to break Will free when Paul appears. Depending on the choice you make before Act 5 starts, Paul will either want the countermeasure back or to have it destroyed. Either way, he's not going to go down without a fight. Do you remember that specific part of the game I plan on mentioning later? Yeah, this is it. I don't want to have to say this, but Paul's fight is very poorly designed in terms of location and his attacks. And that sucks to say because this is the very last part of the game. So because the specific part of the game doesn't exactly explain what to do, I will. While fending off security during this fight, Paul has two attacks. One that forms a bright red circle under Jack, causing an explosion, and another that almost covers the entire swimming hall. The circle attack shows right under Jack before it even tries damaging him. It takes a couple of seconds for this attack to register, but using time rush when you see it will guarantee that you will successfully avoid it. After killing security, Paul will then use his explosion attack. You'll immediately know when he uses it because the camera points to where it forms. The camera decides to lock in place of where the explosion forms for a couple of seconds, which will probably mess up where you want Jack to go to avoid it. From here, you can either use time dodge and time rush to run away from it, or you can use time stop and then the other two when the camera points at it to hold it for a brief moment, allowing you to create more distance. This attack is very broken as it covers almost the entire hall and will immediately kill Jack if you're not far away from it. After Paul does this attack a couple of times, he'll become fatigued and gives Jack the opportunity to shoot him, and that's really all this fight is. If you decided to collect the chronon sources mentioned earlier, then this fight should be a bit easier. This last part of the game is kinda difficult and hard if your abilities aren't upgraded, but rest assured that it is possible to beat. After defeating Paul, Jack kills Paul with a punch that makes him land awkwardly on his neck and as a result breaking it. He frees Will from the stutter and the two use the countermeasure to stabilize the fracture, and Paul is nowhere to be seen after. And in so regards to this cutscene right here, I love these two so fucking much. I love the way Jack pats his brother on the back as a way of saying we did it, because they did. Two brothers saved the world and had the best possible dynamic I've ever witnessed in a video game. Watching this cutscene for the first time made me cry a bit, so much that I talked a lot about it with my friends after. I was just really excited and happy with the game I'd completed. If it weren't for Shawn getting his role as Lamplighter in The Boys Season 2, I really don't think I would have ever played this game unless it were recommended to me. Am I essentially saying that I discovered a game because I found a guy hot? Yeah, but I don't think that's an issue at all. The moment Capcom released the announcement trailer for Resident Evil 3, I knew what I was getting myself into. Yeah, I found the new Carlos hot, but my second favorite Resident Evil game is getting remade and had released 4 months later, and I enjoyed every bit of what it had to offer. It's always really interesting wanting to find out what a certain actor has played in and being like, I might actually enjoy this, and I just so happened to actually enjoy what Quantum Break had to offer. I think Shawn is a really cool and chill guy, and I'm thrilled to see what other projects he has yet to announce. I also just think both him and his brother are adorable if I'm being completely honest. So yeah, Quantum Break is pretty good. After finishing the game, I'd asked some friends if they've ever played it before. Most said they'd heard of it, but they forgot about it, and that kinda sucks to hear. It makes me wonder if other games announced at the time of its release took the spotlight and made everyone go play those games instead, and I think that's exactly what might have happened. I grew up playing single player games, so they're special to me. I enjoy replaying them too. I also wish this game offered some kind of challenge mode after beating it, where you can fend off endless waves of security as it progressively gets more difficult after each wave. It's something the game could easily benefit from, but unfortunately there doesn't seem to be one. One thing about the main menu theme I wanted to say that I mentioned earlier. It starts differently depending on which act you left off on. Take a listen. This is a neat little touch and allows you to listen different versions of essentially the same thing, and it's good for me because I really like this theme a lot. If Quantum Break 2 ever happens, I will be really happy. I want to see Shawn Ashmore return as Jack Joyce in all of his time manipulating glory, but right now, all we have is this, and I'm fine with that. I didn't finish this game expecting it to make my life just a little better, and that's exactly what it did, and I'm glad I discovered it when I did. If this video somehow convinced you to try out this game, I hope you can play this timeless underrated gem sooner or later. And I hope you all enjoyed this video and what it had to offer. Let's hope Jack Joyce will return someday. Thank you for watching.